Hi, this is Misha, and this is another episode of Versus. Really, up till now, we've done bolt-action guns, but we're going to get into semi-autos. And yes, before anyone asks, this will ultimately come to, I'm sure, the one everyone wants to know, AK versus M16. But we need to really start at the beginning. So we're going to do the US M1 Garand in 30-06 versus the Soviet-Russian SVT Tokarev in 7.62 54 rimmed, or 7.62 Nagant, or Mosin if you wish. And these are really actually very comparable. Now, we have full history videos, but just to kind of go over it briefly. In World War I, America was using bolt actions, the 1903 and the 1917. After the war, many in the military were interested in adopting a semi-automatic or select fire rifle for a general issue to replace bolt actions. There was a lot of talk about this in the 1920s, but you know, there was tests here and there, different cartridges, so on and so forth. Trials beginning in the late 20s. There were trials with the Garand and other guns in a Pedersen cartridge in 1931, where the Garand showed itself to be promising. But then they decided they wanted to keep using 30-06, 7.62 by 63, so they had to rework the Garand. And again, it showed itself quite promising in 1933 and was recommended for adoption. Now, the Garand was the brainchild primarily of John Garand, working at the Springfield Armory, the original military, the original government one. The original design used a gas trap or bang system, and actually this would be what would initially be adopted. It also used a rotating bolt. And the first versions could either have detaching mags, usually they were modified BAR mags, just because that's what was available. And then later the military would kind of insist on this internal 8-round magazine, the en-bloc clip system that we're pretty well familiar with. This would be officially adopted in 1936 and go into production a short time later. Keep in mind, it was a gas trap. This led to issues. So in 1940, the design was reworked to have an actual port in the barrel and a gas piston system. And this would really become the famous gun of World War II. Now, there were plenty, at least a reasonable number, of gas trap Garands manufactured and even issued in the late 30s and very early 40s, but most were retrofitted in service to the piston system. But a few survive today, very rare, very valuable. From there, this would be manufactured by Winchester and Springfield during World War II, and would continue to be manufactured during Korea by Harrington and Richardson and International Harvester, with the final guns, you know, assembled in the mid-50s. And they would do over 6 million, about 6.2, 6.3 million of these. It would be the standard issue gun in the U.S. military from 1936 until being replaced by the very similar M14 in 1957, although a lot of these would still be in service through the late 50s and into the early 60s as the M14s came online. So reasonably successful. It served America well in World War II and Korea. So what about the Tokarev? In a way, it has a very similar development history. We have two names, two Russian designers we should really think about. Tokarev, of course, but also Simonov. Now, Simonov did not create this, but it was his work that really spurred Tokarev on. Stalin was also interested, much like the U.S. military, in a self-loading rifle in the 1920s, with one difference. Russia had actually fielded in very limited numbers in World War I a select fire gun known as the 1916 Fedorov. This fired the 6.5 Japanese Arisaka cartridge, and only a very few were built during the war, and a few more than that after World War I. So Russia had very limited experience with an infantry rifle and select fire. As in the USA, development was slow but steady in the 20s, with Tokarev and Simonov coming up on top during trials in the late 20s and early 30s. Now, they did try various systems, including a recoil-operated system, kind of like a Browning shotgun, and they did try the Bang system, the gas trap, but this was tossed out very, very early on in the 1930s because it wasn't seen as reliable and durable enough. In 1934-35, there were trials, and at this time they were wanting a select fire gun, and it was going to be chambered in 7.62 by 54 rimmed, the same cartridge that the Mosin Nagant used. Okay, well, Simonov won these first round of trials, and his rifle, the AVS-36, was adopted, intended for general issue in 1936. So really, the idea was the same as the USA, but this never went into full-scale production, although they made tens of thousands, if not 100,000, depending on who you ask. But they did make them, but there were issues, it saw combat, yada yada. So there were new trials, and this is where the Tokarev comes in. In 1938, the SVT-38 was selected. Now, unlike the AVS-36, the SVT-38 was semi-automatic only. It did not have full auto. And so Tokarev's rifle would win and go into mass production. And then it was updated in 1940, much like the M1 Garand was updated in 1940, to the SVT40. So both guns, kind of very similar dates there. Now, where the M1 Garand was highly successful, the SVT series really wasn't. Now, they made about 1.6 million, so not a small number, but there were some inherent problems, and there were issues with the cartridge being overpowered, and really what doomed this gun, and why it really only saw service in World War II, was Russia's pushing ahead. America kind of stagnated with the M1 Garand. Russia really led the way with the SKS, which was the Simonov design. Again, he's coming on top, and its new 7.62 39 cartridge, and then of course the very famous Kalashnikovs. So that's really why this gun didn't go any further than it did, was developments, plus Russia in the beginning was fighting a defensive war, and they could simply produce Mosin Nagants much faster than these critters. That said, Germans and the Finns really liked the SVT. So it had things. So let's look at these. Overall, we're at about 48 inches, so pretty long gun. We've got about a 24.5-inch barrel, plus a muzzle brake here. But we're pretty lightweight. We're at about 8.5 pounds. It's a pretty slim, svelte gun because weight was always a concern. Take the Garand, though. Overall, we're just a smidge under 44 inches, so we're shorter. We have a slightly shorter barrel at 24 inches, no muzzle brake, but we weigh more. We're at 9.5 pounds, so the extra weight really comes from the gas system, the heavier, thicker stock, and just the gun itself being a little more robust. Now, cartridge-wise, we're pretty similar. 7.62 by 63, 30-06 is a little longer and heavier. That's not good. But then again, where 7.62 54 rimmed is shorter and lighter, it's a rimmed round, which makes operating in a semi-auto a little more problematic. But this never had to contend with the gas trap system, so that's something in its favor. It is a short stroke gas piston, and it's even adjustable, so pretty modern gas system. The bolt is a tilting bolt, much like what you would see in the SKS or the FAL later. So that's pretty good. Doesn't lend itself to superb accuracy, but it works. Decent trigger, a little heavy but smooth. The M1 Garand uses the rotating bolt, which actually in a way would be copied by Kalashnikov, and I would say generally has a better trigger. On the other hand, its gas system, even after the change from gas trap to gas piston, is a little wonkier. We have this kind of asymmetrical op rod on one side, and it moves, exposing your barrel, so crud can get in here. Also, fingers can get in there and get mushed. And it's a pretty darn long gas system. It goes all the way out here, whereas the SVT's is much shorter. So something to be aware of. I would say better bolt system, but not as good of a gas system in this gun. Also not as good, I'm sorry, it's pretty clear the N-block system is very much a throwback. Again, while they tried the Garand out, the prototypes out with detachable mags, they went with the N-block, and that was a very old style. Whereas the SVT uses very modern detachable mags. Now this has a lock on it so the mags couldn't be accidentally dumped. You just take them out. They are 10 round, double stack even, slightly curved mags. They usually issued 3 to 5 with each gun, so we have extra mags, and they just kind of go in. And again, this will lock here like that if you don't want to accidentally hook this rather large mag catch and drop your mag out. As you saw, it also has a last round bolt hold open, which is nice. So I'm going to give the win on that to the SVT. It has a better mag system. Safety is this wing style. It just goes right behind the trigger. Nothing special there, one way or the other. Likewise, the M1 Garand safety is nothing special, but it's even in front of the trigger, meaning you have to go in the trigger guard to turn it off, which modern safety would not like. So even though this is also in the trigger guard because it's literally behind the trigger, I'm going to give a slight edge to the safety on the SVT. On the other hand, the sights on the Garand are clearly superior. The US was always concerned with accuracy. Now these are the early World War II lock bar sights, which aren't quite as good as the later ones, but still we have a fully adjustable peep. It's located very far back on the receiver. The front, we have a protected front post. So very good combat type sights. The SVTs aren't the worst in the world, but we have a more traditional ladder with notch rear here, located at the end of the barrel, not at the back of the receiver. Much smaller notch, mostly just elevation adjustable. Now the front sight is a smaller stud, much like you would see in the SKS and even somewhat like the AK later. It is fully enclosed like a Mosin, so that's nice, nicely protected, and it is drift adjustable. But I'm going to give it to the M1 Garand there. It just kind of has to be. Now this does have a muzzle brake, which is nice, but it is lighter, and of course with such a heavy cartridge, every ounce matters. We do have a perforated shroud here around the barrel, relatively short. Like I said, the stock is pretty light. They did have trouble with these cracking sometimes in the field, so they did come up with a heavier duty stock during the war. The M1 Garand, on the other hand, much beefier stock, although this front part protecting the barrel is a little fragile at times because it's pretty well unsupported. But I'm still going to say the stock's a little little better. Now, ergonomically, I actually like how the SVT stock feels. They're both semi-pistol grab. This is very chunky and square. This is much more rounded and appealing. So ergonomics, I'm going to give it to the SVT, but durability to the Garand. Plus, this one has a storage compartment, which is nice. They both mount a blade bayonet. Nothing different there. The final thing is disassembly. The M1 Garand, you know, you pull the trigger guard, you pull the action out of the stock, and you go from there. And you have to disassemble the front, including removing your front sight for cleaning the gas system. I do not like, really, the Garand's disassembly. There are issues that crop up because of it. The SVT would be much more familiar to us today. You can remove it from its stock if needed, but you don't have to. This just comes forward, your bolt comes out, and your gas system, you take your top cover off here, your thing, and then you can take your gas piston out. I'm going to say disassembly is better for this, just because you don't have to worry about losing accuracy by taking the gun in and out of its stock, and you don't have to completely remove your front sight. Now, this can be removed, but it doesn't have to be for basic maintenance. In the end, the Garand was decidedly a more successful design. Many more were made. It was in service much longer. This gun's service didn't really last much past World War II. They both really came around at the same time, and they both had their genesis back in the 1920s. But I have to say that in theory, the SVT is a better gun, because you see a lot of the nods that come later. It was focused on being lightweight, which is something that has come along. One thing I didn't mention, by standard, they were going to do scope rails on these, so that was a standard thing. To mount a scope on the M1 Garand, you needed to have a special type of receiver mount, so that was a forward-thinking thing, optics compatibility. The magazine is clearly better on the SVT. The gas system is more forward-thinking, and I think that's pretty empirical, because while you don't see many M1 Garand style gas systems after the 1950s, this short stroke system from the SVT was carried over to miniguns. It was copied first by the Germans for the G43, and then appeared later in many other guns, and of course a modified form. And finally, the inclusion of a muzzle brake. Muzzle device as standard is very forward-thinking. And of course what these were issued with, multiple magazines, was a very forward-thinking notion for the late 30s, early 40s. Now, to be fair, the Garand was issued with multiple in-block clips because it had to be. But the in-block is just not my favorite thing. It limits you, it's hard to load. I know you can load an half-empty in-block, but it's much more convoluted. It's much easier to load a full 8-rounder. Whereas with the SVT, you can have 2 rounds or 6 or whatever. And theoretically, they could have made 20-round mags for the SVT. There's no limit, whereas this is pretty well limited. So while this was more successful in the real world, I think that the design cues from the SVT were more forward-thinking, and that's really why Russia started to lead the way after the end of the Nazi German regime in basically small arms development for a while. The SKS and the AK were ahead of their Western counterparts for a time, at least in certain ways. But that is a story for another video. So there's my opinion on versus. Real world combat, the Garand wins, but design concepts, the SVT was a more forward thinking gun. If you have any questions or comments, we really welcome them below as always. If you liked the video, we'd appreciate it if you'd click like and also share. And if you really liked the video, we'd really appreciate it if you'd check out the link to our Patreon page, and also the playlist for other versus videos and the history on both of these guns if you'd like to hear more. Well, this is Misha, and we will catch you next time.